So, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Scholar Spotlight with Global Policy Next Generation. Today we have the brilliant Jill Toh, who is a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam Institute for Information Law. She's here today to talk a bit more in depth about her Scholar Spotlight questionnaire and also her really fascinating research into data, labour, law and political economy, and specifically looking at the gig economy and how the perspective of labour can enable a more just political economy of data. So Jill, thank you so much for joining us. I've been really looking forward to chatting with you and learning a bit more about your experiences and work. So to start, I'd love to just hear a bit more about you and your work. So could you maybe just give us that quick 30-second elevator pitch style introduction of who you are and what you're working on currently?
Yeah, okay, I'll try my best. And thank you so much for having me. So as Amy said, I am a PhD student in my second year. And in terms of my research, I'm really looking to try to understand how the perspective of labor can create a more just political economy of data. And I take a more social legal approach to data and algorithmic management in the gig economy, and basically focusing on the ride hailing and delivery careers in Europe. Because when you look at a lot of the technology regulation, this perspective of labor tends to often be left out. So there's often a lot of focus on, the citizen, the consumer, etc., but not so much labor. And I think what is happening in the gig economy, particularly with forms of resistance, forms of solidarity, and also the ways that they use legal and political mobilization strategies to resist certain power asymmetries, I think this perspective is very useful for thinking about the ways in which technology can be regulated and increasingly so as technology becomes more imbued in our lives. So I'm really interested in how gig workers resist and mobilize against these power asymmetries, and what can we learn from building collective power and the role of how, what role does data play in this, and additionally, I think what is the role of law in mobilizing worker power?
Yeah, so definitely really interesting and incredibly relevant work. I mean, I'm sure all of us have probably used those gig economy deliveries for our takeout or our fast food or whatever it is. So I think we can all relate to that in some way. But so just, I guess, to start from the start, so for someone who would be considering going down the same path and pursuing a PhD, what motivated you to do one and to pursue a research career? And I guess kind of what advice would you give to any master's students who are in that same area and that same field if they were applying for a PhD?
I think for the first point that I would like to raise is that think carefully and deeply about whether you want to apply for a PhD in the first place, because I think it is a very challenging task, and I think sometimes when you take some time to do other things first, like go work in a nonprofit or go work in the private sector or do other things, this can also give you perspective when you enter academia. I would say that for me personally, I've done a bunch of different things before coming in, and I think the one really beautiful thing about academia, there are many problems with academia, of course, but I think the one beautiful thing about academia is that it allows you to create, right? It allows you to have these ideas, to build on people's work and kind of create new ideas on your own. And it's very much, for me, it's very much like the arts, or like when you think of making music or painting, I think it's about translating some of your ideas, values, thoughts onto paper, and in this sense, writing. So I think looking at that from the aspect, meaning that if you're thinking of academia, think of it like why do you want to do it, and what's the purpose that's driving you? And I think many academics have different purposes to drive them. For me, I think that academia is a way that you have the ability to create something, and two, there's also this intellectual stimulation that comes with being able to take a broader perspective of things that possibly you might not be able to do in policy making, that you might not be able to do in civil society, because you don't have this space to be able to think of longer term questions. So for me, these are some of the reasons. But more than anything, I think it's also really a space in which you can really try to tackle some of the injustices that that you see in society, to write about it, to think about it, to also be able to be actively involved with some of these struggles. So I think these are a constellation of things to I think why I'm here. And if you are obviously thinking of doing it, I would say definitely reach out to people, reach out to like professors that teach you, PhD, postdocs, anyone that you can think of within academia, because the problem with academia is always very closed off. Meaning if you ask me, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, did I think of this career? I'll be like, well, sure, but I don't really know what it is at all, because it's really closed off from society. You can't just go to, I don't know, LinkedIn to search for it, right? Or you don't really have this in career fairs, for example, that universities tend to organize. So I would say really reach out to people that you come in contact with throughout your studies in your masters, people that teach you, your tutors, people that supervise you, and then just kind of ask them, hey, what is it like? Because I think this limits a lot of people's entry into it, particularly if you think that academia is something like, it's only like male professors that ever taught me in my school, right, or in my university, and I don't really identify with that. So I think don't be afraid to ask if you're really considering of taking down that path.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's great advice. And like you say, you can really make the most of the connections that you have to learn more a bit about it. But I mean, you mentioned then about being able to try and address injustices or things that are wrong with our, I guess for you more like specifically with the gig economy and labour law. And obviously your research is very interdisciplinary and you focus on, I mean, platform worker relations, data governance, specifically in the gig economy, but also through the political economy lens. And I mean, what made you interested in those topics? And what would you say some of the issues that you faced when researching those have been? Like, how did you find your way? Obviously you found your way into doing a PhD through that ability to be able to learn and create, but what drew you specifically to those areas?
I think it seems a bit that I'm in, thinking about technology, and some people come into technology because they really, they're interested in the technology in itself. I think I come from it from a perspective of like the perspective of social injustice, right? And okay, you can ask like, oh, why do you gravitate to these topics? I mean, of course, there's a variety of reasons, from your own upbringing to your own positionality to how you experience the world, and then how you formulate your sense of self vis-a-vis that. So I think I've, in that sense, always had that feeling, or whether it's through experience or whether it's through observing things, that the way that the world is constructed is not fair. And I think part of me of doing research that feels very personal, feels that for me, it seems very hard to detangle fully your own personal stance and the research that you do. I think some academics or some professors or some people would disagree with that, like, taking this distance. But for me personally, I think it's very tied to things that you're not okay with. And if you think of the context of labor, which I think everybody's implicated in, because, well, most people work. So yes, I'm writing about the gig economy and I'm writing about drivers, or I'm writing about delivery people. But, if you look at academia, you can also imagine that it is very precarious, that we are also workers. So I think that the context of labor, for me, felt very inherent to the way we live and the way society is structured. And therefore, the problems that emerge out of it is something that I feel very interested in, or feel that should be improved. And then you couple that with, technology, and you couple that with things that have been developed, and how these things mesh together. And I think that's a little bit how I fell into these topics. I think also the fact that I come from Singapore, which is very high tech, in the sense of things are very digital. I grew up in this environment. I grew up in the fact that how to see kind of like forms of oppression that can occur through these means. So it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly one specific point, but I think it's really a merging of different things, and then exacerbated by the use of technology that allowed me to come into these topics. And I think in terms of interdisciplinarity, I think my background, because I did a bachelor in media studies, and then I did a master's in international relations, and then now I'm in the law faculty. I think naturally this interdisciplinary work emerges from that. So you can either say I'm super confused, I have no idea what I'm doing, or there's some coherent reasoning to why I'm here. But I would say that interdisciplinarity is very difficult, at least within the constructs of the academy at the moment, because obviously departments are siloed, and there's like not just departments but also journals or conferences. I do think with the technology kind of field, it is opening it up because technology inherently affects different areas of society. But the issue with interdisciplinarity work is that it takes a lot of time. You're like reading into different fields, and I think that the common struggle is that you always feel that you're never really an expert in one. But for me, the reality is that it requires interdisciplinarity because of the issues that are happening, right? You can say this with climate as well, for example. So I think the struggle is like coping with the fact that, there needs to be better structures that are built to support interdisciplinarity work. It's not just, let's take one expert from here, one expert from there, right? Okay, that's maybe cross-disciplinary, but like interdisciplinary, where you're weaving, things together, it's always difficult because a discipline has your own language, a discipline has its own terms. And so I think creating the conditions for that, we're still kind of so far off, but I also think it's just very necessary.
I think that definitely sounds very coherent. I don't think you sound confused at all. I also think, it's very interesting with the interdisciplinarity and conducting research within that. And I mean, would you have any advice to other researchers who are pursuing similar research in tech in these interdisciplinary manner about how to navigate that, or how best to maybe not get around, but to work with the fact of how, you say journals or conferences might be specifically targeted at a particular area? Like, how do you work with that practically every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think so try to figure out, I think, the types of journals that are more open to interdisciplinary thinking, because there are, and maybe like newer ones, also like, what you are involved in, and what this journal that you have, you're part of, is also like trying to create those conditions. So look for that type of journals. I would say, rather than say necessarily looking at purely just journal rankings, for example, because the more traditional ones are definitely more deeply rooted in its specific discipline. So I think that's one practical area. Two, I think talking to people from various disciplines helps a lot. But that takes time. And I think, for me, it's also a bit difficult to say because I'm a pandemic PhD. So I started my PhD in a pandemic, which means I've never been to an actual in-person conference. But through the exchanges I've had online, I think this is kind of the way to, like, conferences or reaching out to people who are kind of very active in the discipline, to talk to them, because you have to already scour a lot of literature. But when you go to or you attend events or conferences, this is usually where the most recent type of scholarship is at. And so I think that gives you a bit of ability to sense what is being talked about in that field, as a quick way, or at least maybe not quick, but maybe more, at least you get a better sense of what type of scholarship to dive into. Because if you're only reading, there's really no end to this at the rate that things are being produced as well. And try, I would say that in certain areas things are changing, right? So the fact that I am not a lawyer, but I'm at a law faculty, and particularly at the Institute for Information Law, that there are these communities and there are these research institutes that are open to more interdisciplinary work. And then I think it's more like, how do you sustain it? So it's not just building, meaning, so, okay, there's one level of hiring, but there's also like, how do you sustain it? Meaning, like, how can you create more workshops around it to facilitate knowledge sharing? Is there ways to collaborate that is not really just collaboration on paper, but actually taking the time to sit down and speak to each other, discuss with each other, write things together that will naturally take more time because you're trying to combine different perspectives. And I think the one big hurdle that you see is really an issue of time. So in academia, you're always, I think, really expected to publish a lot. And if you're doing work that requires more time, this can it would be a bit of a difficult trade-off as it stands right now. And that's why everyone is strapped for time. Nobody has time to invest, to kind of push things further or take time to explain. And I think that's the one limitation or one of the things that academia has to work on more broadly, if we're interested in doing this kind of work.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's all really useful advice. I think, especially when you mention about being a pandemic PhD candidate, I think it's probably had quite a big influence on a lot of people who've never been to in-person conferences, as you say. So it's good to be able to have that advice of how to like maybe navigate that side of things as well. So how you can apply that approach in both in-person and online situations. So, but I think talking more about reading, and obviously you scour a lot of literature and you go through all these journals and find lots of information. And I mean, you mentioned in your questionnaire that you admire many different academics and you've been inspired across many different fields and areas. But I wanted to ask, what kind of influence do you think they have had on your academic career? And do you think that influence is constantly changing, or do you think that influence is quite cemented in from the start?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the good thing or the nice thing about being able to read across different disciplines is that it also shows you that you can be like a different type of academic, and that there are different avenues for you to decide what kind of research you want to do, what kind of methods you want to employ, what kind of trajectory you want to do. So I feel that in that sense of being able to read stuff across disciplines has really helped me to think through that. And in particular for me, I think I didn't realize this until I started my PhD, was how formative I think my undergraduate kind of readings and exposure to certain authors have shaped a little bit the way that I think. So a lot of this comes from, the critical school, and also a lot of feminist authors that I think I still, even if I'm not directly incorporating this into my work, there's very, very much this strand of thinking that has shaped me. And I think starting a law PhD, really the law and political economy movement has shaped a lot of the way that I think about the law, I think, because I think if you're legally trained, a lot of the time you just take the law as it is, or there's this neutrality to the law. But what I realized that, with the LP scholars is that there is a way of approaching the law from this more, the law is a construct kind of methodology, theoretical kind of underpinnings. And actually this also links very much back to, things that I read as an undergrad, like Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, right? When just a very kind of like mainstream author. Do I see it shifting? I think so, in terms of probably I don't see myself as a static kind of like person or researcher, but I do think that it would still be fundamentally undergirded by certain values of like what research is, what kind of theoretical standpoint you have of the world, maybe not just research. And I think this still will remain, but it's hard to say, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's hard to pinpoint exactly whether something will change or not, but I completely understand what you're saying about how it can kind of, certain things will stay with you and be the grounding of how you might change your views moving on from that, which I think is, it's obviously part of learning, isn't it, and developing our knowledge. So, but I think going back to your questionnaire as well, I think you mentioned about how different areas that your field might be refocusing on in the future, and so you suggested, one of the things could be a broader, more critical view of the role of law in the regulation of technology. So as you just mentioned, looking at law as more of a social construct and viewing it through the law and political economy lens, rather than maybe taking it as it is, or having like more social justice approaches to research and an increased understanding of that intersection between labour and labour law, and then technology and data and all those disciplines coming together. So I mean, if your field does refocus on that, what kind of changes would you anticipate to see within those areas? I know obviously it's quite hard to predict those things, but if you were going to think about the kind of things moving forwards, what do you think you could see happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I guess it depends on which perspective we're talking about. Are we talking in that sense of more like, the direction that academic research is going, or we're talking about like for very much the digital and technology regulation sphere, it's like, okay, well, what kind of direction that is going? I mean, of course they intersect, but I think in terms of overall for like technology regulation, I do think that the discourse has changed a little bit, in terms of there are more people looking into these kind of laws and regulation from maybe different perspectives. So as you mentioned, like for example, the social justice kind of approach towards research on digital technologies, I really see that momentum kind of building both on the civil society level, but also within the research and academic level. And I think that influence in the policy and legal sphere is really important, because I think what this perspective takes is really trying to center, or really trying to prioritize the fact that people that are harmed at scale by these technologies are often not protected by these regulations when regulating these technologies. And I think as we come to grips with the ways that technology impact our lives, I think the people that are most harmed, it becomes again visible that the people are most harmed are often, the people that are either super precarious, at least what you see in the gig economy, or people that don't even know that they're being harmed. So this is nothing new, I would say, like within the context of capitalism, this is nothing new in the sense that the people that with the least power are the most exploited, etc. But what I sense a little bit with technology now being this thing that people talk about with AI, etc., that hopefully gives us another wave in which you can really talk about exploitation and expropriation, and not really through the lens of technology, but the fact that this resurfaces some of the issues that we've been plagued with for a long time. So I do hope that the technology debate starts focusing, or continues to focus more on these kind of areas. And I think with the gig economy, I do think that there is a lot of momentum with a resurgence of workers kind of coming together. I wouldn't say the revival of trade unions, but kind of there is a little bit of pickup in that. And I think building worker power and having, giving these workers a voice are very important kind of developments, both in research and also outside of the academy. And I think I hope to see more of is also just research coming out more, not just from Europe, but also from other contexts, and how that changes the way we understand, things about the gig economy, which, has already been criticized that for Europe, the gig economy is called the gig economy, but this has always been prevalent in other parts of the world. So things like that I do see emerging. Yeah.
No, definitely. I think very interesting. But so, I mean, if your research suggests having kind of an increased focus on workers and trying to address those power asymmetries to shift towards social justice goals and protecting the most vulnerable through like global policy changes, what kind of changes would you envision policymakers making to try and implement that? And like, if you could talk to them, what would you want them to know?
I mean, I think that, and I think this is what the LPE kind of strand has kind of been arguing for, which is that, policymakers or governments or regional kind of like bodies, we're still all like living within this system, right? That they're not separate from this. So like, either you want to call it neoliberal governance, or do you want to call it whatever term that you can describe it, is the fact that we still live in a system where even the people that the public authorities or the people that are supposed to have the good of the people, they still fall within that. So I do think that particularly for my field would really be to look more closely, I think, at the harms that technology has onto workers or to other groups of people, and try, I think, to prioritize that when they think of technology, rather than solely just thinking of innovation or growth. I think that is a shift that I hope to see. So it doesn't necessarily have to be workers, I don't think. But I think the idea that we need to pursue this at the cost of innovation becomes very problematic as it currently stands. And I think particularly for the European Union or in a European context, that there is a lot of hypocrisy that says, okay, fundamental rights, we want to uphold fundamental rights, and a little bit of tension with the way that the internal market has to be managed also based on EU competencies. So I would like to say, I think a bit like put your money where your mouth is. If you want to govern by specific fundamental right values, then, well, you kind of need to properly reassess that. And then also really thinking more broadly, like what kind of fundamental rights are you upholding? Because fundamental rights is a bucket of things and they are also in tension with each other. I guess no concrete policy recommendations, because I'm also talking quite broadly. But I would say just, I guess, more of a ideological shift, maybe, which is always hard to achieve, I think.
Yeah, so in a drastic flip, to go from policymakers and the advice you would give to them to now ask you about ECRs and the advice you might give to ECRs, I think from your questionnaire, your advice is to surround yourself with people that you trust and who you're interested in building communities that uplift each other's work, and also importantly knowing when to say yes and no and to prioritize your mental health. I just wanted to ask, kind of to go back to that, if you had any advice or tips that you would give to people on how to build those kind of networks, or how to advise someone on when to know how to say no and having the confidence to be able to do that, because I think obviously that's always a challenging thing as well. So how would you recommend someone to take that advice as best as they can?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I think first and foremost, it really depends on the type of academic you are or the type of personality that you are. For some people, they really thrive in a specific context where they don't really need these communities. They're really fine being on their own and depends on their research, etc. So I think there are many factors to that. So I only speak, I guess, from the position of myself, which is that I think academia is obviously very competitive as an environment. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree that, that if someone claims a space, then there's no space for others. I maybe am idealistic, but I do think there should be space for more people to be involved. And so in terms of reaching out these communities, I guess it starts very much from, okay, do you have similar research interests? Is this person or these people writing things that appeals to you? Okay. Or do you actually, like, you go to a talk or you go to somebody, listen to someone speak about something that you feel this person is someone that you want to connect with? Try to see who these people are writing with, or who these people are kind of not hanging out with, but where are these circles? And it's hard to guess, like, where are these circles? So either you're at an institute, or I don't know, you see on Twitter even, maybe, who is like doing stuff with what. And I think if you feel that this is like people that inspire you, then again, like I mentioned earlier, reach out, because a lot of the time they will, at least in my experience, like one or two people that I've kind of like, listened to, I was just want to talk to this person. It feels as if you don't know what to say, but they know that if you're early career researcher, sometimes if they're willing to even speak to you, then you don't have to worry too much that you need to say something. They're just asking them a little bit for advice. How should I do this? I know other people that have sent some of their work out to people that they kind of like, and I think that's another method. But I do think it is difficult. Even for me, I'm still struggling in a way, like, where do I fit in? And I think this also links back to the interdisciplinarity of work, is that, like, you have this sense of like, where do I fit in? But I do think I'm growing to think that there are pockets of people. It's just you need to try to seek them out, and seeking them out either at conferences or seeking them out by just, emailing them, sending them a message, which I think can be very difficult for some people that are maybe less sociable or less extroverted, for example. So I would say try to find ways around it, and just know that it's not it's not easy. And I think a lot of people do struggle with that. And in terms of saying no to things, what helps a little bit is if you, I guess, talk to your supervisors or talk to people that you work with and be, hey, I am supposed to do this. Should I say yes? Should I say no? So get someone to hold you accountable to how you are. And I think this links back a little bit to like finding people you trust, because if you trust that you can bounce some of these ideas or thoughts or decision making to someone else who knows you, so not just, they're not just saying, oh, you should say yes because it's good for your career, but they know you because how you handle stress, how much you already have on your plate, etc. Then it gives you, I think, some level of confidence to say, okay, no, I'm not going to do this. And sometimes I think it's constantly drawing boundaries is really difficult, because you can draw boundaries and someone of power can just step all over it, right? So you take this effort to say no or yes to things, and then someone just says, well, I completely disregard this. And I think that's part of it. Like, you have to try to build resilience, over it, because I don't think it gets better in that sense. Like I don't want to be so like doom and gloom, but I think you learn, a lot of it is learning how you're going to cope with these kind of conditions, while also pushing for change more structurally, I would say, by building your own, if you're early career researcher, you are also the future of academia. So I think it's two ways, like on an individual way of like learning to deal with it, and then if you have the chance to structurally, how do you change that kind of environment? Yeah.
Very helpful advice. I think, like you say, it's always important to surround yourself with good people as well, just anyway, but that can really help you knowing which paths to go down or which things are genuinely good for you or not. It's always good to have that support. But I think, and lastly, just to wrap it up, I have one final question, which is that you recommend us to read Julie Cohen's Between Truth and Power, The Legal Constructions of Informational Capitalism. I just wondered, why did you pick this title, and why would you recommend for all of us to read it? So
yeah, I think it's a really great book. Julie Cohen's also really great. And also it kind of, I think the book was released just before I started my PhD in law. And so I think that was really like a really nice timing for me to chance upon this book. So this book talks a lot about like how increasingly private companies have gained a lot of power, and then she talks about it more in the context of tech companies, but you can also draw parallels to older forms of private power. But she critically assesses the role of law that has played in either helping them construct this power or sustaining this power. So in this time of in this landscape of what she calls informational capitalism, basically, propertized data is like the new land, and datafied production, which, in relation to the gig economy and labor precarity generally, is the new labor. And there's these platforms and platformized transactions that kind of enables it. And I think she does a really good way of showing how the law has constituted some of these accumulation of power, and therefore leading this to some of the issues around, democracy and inequality that we have today. So I thought it was just a really well written and theoretically sound book. She draws a lot on Polanyi's The Great Transformation, and at least for this field, I think it was a really good contribution on really kind of showing law's constitutive role in some of these things that we see today, which I feel is very important because of, there's just so much regulation coming out of this like data and technology space that I think it offers a good critical overview of the fact that regulation can, support existing structures and existing power dynamics.
Well, I mean, I've definitely added it to my reading list. It sounds incredibly interesting, and I think you've sold it very well. So thank you very much for that very nice description of it. But that definitely sounds very interesting. But so that was my last question. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and sharing both your work and just your insights of your academic experience, your motivations and advice that you would give. It's been really interesting and definitely very helpful as well. So thank you very much. And I'm sure that hopefully we will get to see or speak to you again sometime in the future. So thank you very much, Jill.
Thank you for having me.